The night was alive in whispers, crickets harmonizing with the distant ripple of a lake under a watchful moon. Beneath a solitary lamppost, a bench stood like a forgotten stage, waiting for its players. On it sat Michael, a man who carried the weight of 48 years in his tired gaze. His fingers danced absently over the pages of a weathered journal, each turn revealing a secret tethered to a time long past. From the shadows of the path, another figure emerged, a younger man, Ethan, with a storm cloud trailing behind his eyes. Headphones slung carelessly around his neck, his steps betrayed an air of forced indifference, though his clenched fists told another story. Ethan paused, noticing the man on the bench. He hesitated, as if caught between retreating and staying, before deciding on the latter. The space between them seemed charged, two worlds on the brink of colliding. Ethan sat down without a word, the distance between their bodies contrasting, the unspoken connection forming in the quiet night. Michael glanced sideways, his lips parting slightly as if to speak but closing again. The journal in his lap remained open, its inked words catching the soft light, unreadable yet resonant, like a silent witness to a shared solitude. Ethan's arrival was abrupt, a ripple in Michael's quiet reflection. The younger man dropped onto the bench without permission, the suddenness of it jolting Michael from his reverie. The journal closed with a muted thud, its fragile pages spared from prying eyes, and for a moment, neither man spoke. Silence stretched between them like an invisible wall, thick with unasked questions and unspoken thoughts. Ethan shifted uneasily, the kind of restless energy born from inner turmoil. Finally, he broke the stalemate, his voice low and tinged with forced bravado. "Why is someone like you out here this late?" he asked, his tone an odd mix of curiosity and challenge. Michael's brow furrowed slightly. He hesitated, as if weighing the cost of honesty. "I could ask you the same," he replied, his voice calm but guarded. Ethan shrugged, his fingers fidgeting with the fraying strap of his headphones. "Needed some air," he said, his words evasive. After a pause, he added, almost begrudgingly, "It's been a rough day." Michael steadied him for a moment, his gaze softening. He turned his attention to the bench beneath them, running his hand along its worn wood. "This place," Michael began, his voice distant, "it's special. It's where I used to sit with someone I loved." Ethan looked at him, the sharp edge of his demeanor dulling slightly. There was no pity in his eyes, only recognition, a shared ache, though the stories behind it differed. "I don't know if I even believe in that," Ethan admitted after a long pause. "Love, or maybe I'm just scared of it. Doesn't matter, anyway, my parents, they wouldn't get it. I tried telling them, and now it's just a mess." Michael nodded, as if the confession carried a weight he understood all too well. The silence returned, but this time it felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, tenuous but real. The night deepened, and the lamplight cast their shadows long and slender on the ground, as if the bench itself wove their stories together. Michael leaned back, exhaling slowly, his gaze fixed on the shimmering lake. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, like the start of a song meant only for midnight ears. "It was here," he said, gesturing faintly to the bench beneath them. 30 years ago, on a night not unlike this one. There was a storm rolling in, and I was a different man back then, nervous, and sure." He paused, as if tasting the memory before offering it. "He sat down next to me, soaking wet, laughing at the rain like it was some kind of joke only he understood. His name was David." Ethan tilted his head, listening intently now, his earlier tension softening with curiosity. Michael's lips curved in a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I didn't know what to say to him at first. I'd never met someone so unapologetically himself. He talked about the storm as if it were an old friend and me as if I were someone worth knowing. By the time the rain stopped, I wasn't nervous anymore. He made me feel seen." For a moment, silence returned, heavy with the weight of what wasn't said. Then Ethan broke it, his voice quieter than before. "That sounds incredible, like something out of a movie, but I don't think I'm brave enough for that." "For any of it?" Michael turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Bravery doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you move forward anyway." Ethan looked away, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. "I tried," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I told my parents. Thought maybe they'd try to understand, but they didn't. Now it feels like I'm losing myself just trying to keep them in my life." Michael nodded slowly, the lines on his face deepening with empathy. "I've been there," he said, I grew up in a time when the world was even less kind. I spent years hiding, pretending, thinking that was the only way to survive. But the truth is, you can't be who they want you to be without losing who you are. Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to his hands. So what do I do? Michael placed a hand gently on the bench between them, not quite touching Ethan's. You start by being honest with yourself, and with the world. And you remember that even if it feels like you're alone, you're not. People like you and me, we find each other, eventually. The words hung in the air, a lifeline offered without expectation. Ethan nodded faintly, his expression unreadable but his posture less guarded, as if some small part of him believed it might be true. Michael hesitated, his fingers tracing the edges of the journal in his lap. The lamplight reflected off its worn cover, the years etched into its leather like a map of his heart. Slowly, deliberately, he opened it. The pages fluttered as if they, too, carried a breath of life, and he stopped on a passage he hadn't dared to revisit in years. I don't share this with many people, Michael murmured, his voice softer now, as though the journal demanded reverence. But maybe it's time. He cleared his throat, the words trembling on his lips. David wrote this a week before he passed. He said, "Love doesn't disappear when it's gone. It lingers, like the warmth of the sun long after it sets. It changes you, makes you stronger, even when it leaves you aching. You carry it in every breath, every step, every moment." Ethan shifted beside him, his posture stiffening as the weight of the words settled. He stared at Michael, his eyes shimmering with something unspoken. Finally, he whispered, "I don't think anyone's ever loved me like that. I don't even know if I'd recognize it if they did." Michael closed the journal gently, his gaze steady on Ethan's. "You'd know," he said with quiet certainty. "But you have to let yourself be seen first. If you keep hiding, you'll miss it when it comes." Ethan's breath caught, as though the sentence had struck a chord buried deep. He looked away, his jaw tight, wrestling with something he wasn't ready to name. The night around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a choice to be made. Then, faintly, a sound broke the stillness, a distant clap of thunder, low and rumbling. Ethan flinched, startled, and Michael glanced toward the dark horizon, his expression unreadable. "Storm's coming," Michael said, his voice carrying an edge of something Ethan couldn't quite place. Ethan turned back to him, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" he asked, sensing a shift in the air. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the journal as if it held answers he hadn't yet uncovered. "Sometimes," he said finally, his voice tinged with a strange melancholy, "storms bring clarity. But they also bring truths you might not be ready to face." Ethan's heartbeat quickened, unease prickling at the edges of his thoughts. He opened his mouth to respond, but the thunder growled again, louder this time, as though warning them both of something yet unseen. The air grew still, the faint rustle of leaves giving way to a fragile silence. The distant thunder had faded, leaving only the weight of unspoken thoughts between the two men. Above them, the sky began to shift, its inky darkness melting into shades of deep indigo, hinting at the arrival of dawn. Ethan rose from the bench slowly, as though reluctant to sever the fragile connection they had formed. His movements were tentative, his hands tucked into his pockets to steady their trembling. He glanced at Michael, his expression softer now, touched by a gratitude he struggled to articulate. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words carried the weight of an unspoken promise, one he wasn't sure how to keep but knew he needed to try. Michael nodded, his smile faint yet warm. He remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the journal in his lap. His gaze followed Ethan as the younger man took a step away, hesitated, and then turned back. Without warning, Ethan leaned down and wrapped his arms around Michael in an embrace that was both awkward and profound. For a moment, Michael stiffened, startled by the gesture, but then he relaxed, returning the hug with a quiet strength. Neither spoke. The silence between them said enough. Ethan pulled back, his face flushed, but there was a glimmer of something new in his eyes, a spark of hope, a hint of resolve. He stepped away, his movements lighter now, as though a burden had been lifted. Michael watched as Ethan walked down the path, his figure growing smaller with each step, until he was swallowed by the soft light of the approaching morning. For a moment, Michael remained still, his thoughts lingering on the echoes of his past and the possibilities of what lay ahead. Find out what happens next, subscribe and follow up on their love story. We are Pride Stories Unfiltered. your number one pride.